a lack of funding for women and girls sport, particularly in comparison to men's and boys. Elite sport was identified as a challenge by many of the respondents to the committee's call for evidence in terms of pay for athletes, sponsorship, prize money. So I was wondering if the panel could perhaps tell the committee what the main challenges are affecting funding and opportunities for women and girls sport and physical activities, and how they think that those challenges could be overcome. Who wants to kick off? Kim?
If that's helpful.
Yep,
thanks. Thanks, Convener, and morning committee. Really nice to see you all. I'd just like to note on the record as well, thanks from the Scottish Sports Association's members for the committee visit that they had with our members. I know a number of the committee were there, and that was really well received and a really, I think, open, positive conversation. So huge thanks to the committee and the clerking team for making that happen. I guess, Convener, the starting point from my view of all of that is an understanding of I guess, why, and it's, I think, one of the last times I gave evidence to the committee was one of the key phrases is why we consider sport to be an investment and not a cost. And I think at the moment it's seen as a cost, and I suppose if there's one thing I'd like to think as a panel we could convince you all of and all of your colleagues is that sport needs to be seen more as an investment, and it is that cultural change that we require. If we were to ever think there was a magic wand of saying there is a tool which is fun to start with, which benefits our physical health, our mental health, our social health, our educational attainment, our ability to form friendships, our ability to develop skills, at any extreme, let alone saying there's a 30% reduction in all causes of mortality, 30% extra enhanced well-being, then we'd all bite your hand off for it. But it exists, Convener, and it's called sport and physical activity. And I think that's the starting point in any respect, but particularly, and Flora will be the expert in this, particularly when we're talking about an area where women's health is poorer and we've got poorer levels of participation in women and young girls, then I think this is even more important. From a specific funding point of view, I think there are two particular areas, and colleagues I'm sure will touch on particular aspects in other areas. There's at a national level and there's at a local level. At a national level, most funding, as is true across the voluntary sector, so for our members, who are the governing bodies for the different sports in Scotland, funding tends to be annual. It's often on a longer term agreement, but it is only annual because the investment into Sport Scotland, the national agency, is annual. So Sport Scotland have their hands tied for that, but they can only say, well, you'll get 1 year's funding. So therefore, there's a lot of staff and, all the evidence sessions that you've had, you've had tremendously positive examples of where there are programmes and initiatives and systems making phenomenal differences for women and girls. But a lot of that project funding will be annual. So you're therefore trying to recruit staff, retain staff, motivate staff, get people engaged, knowing that actually, you're potentially on a year's contract. And even if you're on a longer term contract, the funding's annual. So in reality, you've only got that certainty. And again, we're then talking about supporting volunteers. So volunteers aren't free, but the 200,000 people who volunteer in sport in Scotland, 200,000, are supported by a small staff, again, who are trying to support that. So being able to talk about long-term funding and core funding is enormous in being able to recruit and retain the incredibly strong staff that we have across sport and physical activity in Scotland, but also making sure that there's consistency on those programmes, consistency in that delivery and consistency in that support for the volunteers. So that's across the whole voluntary sector, Convener. I'm sure you've heard that from others as well. But that's really true for our members. The caveat for them is Sport Scotland have to get it too in order that it will appeal to them. From a local authority point of view, that's one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure the committee will have heard that from others that have talked. 90% of investment in sport in Scotland goes through local authorities. My question, Convener, would be whether 90% of investment in sport actually goes into sport. And local authorities are facing incredibly difficult times, and none of us make any bones about that, and the trust model, the same. But if you've heard from them, they've also been saying, well, actually, they've got some really difficult decisions to make. They're getting less and less money from their local authority partners, and they're saying, well, the only way we can make ends meet is increasing cost. And who does the cost fall to? The participants. Who are the people who are participating least? Those from most deprived backgrounds. So there's no accident in all of that. So there's a different conversation I think we need to have about local funding and how we change some of that dynamic.
I'm going to move on to our next theme and move to Carol Mochen, who's got some questions on that.
Thanks, Convener. I'm particularly interested to have a bit of a discussion about women and girls' activity at community level. You've talked a wee bit about it. It's so important that people can exercise, take part in activity in their own communities. So I'm interested to hear if there is any models out there that work well particularly for women and girls, either things that we've got examples of here in this country or even further afield. If you don't mind, that would be my first question. I don't know, maybe Kim, would that be okay?
Thanks. It's a great question. And before I come to it, if that's okay, just very briefly on your point, Convener, I think Flora made the incredibly important point about exactly the focus of this is saying if the statutory provision is for adequate provision, we've already heard in the committee's evidence and heard from the submissions of others that women are looking for higher standards around facilities and changing facilities. So if adequate's the benchmark, then it's slightly higher for women. So there's maybe no accident or maybe something we need to be aware of. And I'll come back to facilities in a moment. You won't be surprised to hear, Carol. And I think in terms of the media, Convener, I guess my question for the media would be, what is their role? What is the role of the media? Now, there was a lot of conversation around the commercial outputs and understandably their businesses, I understand that. But surely there's a moral responsibility as an educator to be saying, in the previous Chief Medical Officer's guidelines, because they were reviewed recently and Flora can provide an update on that if needs be, I'm sure, only 4% of the population knew the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines of how healthy you have to be active. So that's only 4%, on the assumption that it's 4% of women within that as well. So mothers aren't being as active as we need them to be. Well, the key indicator of how physically active a young girl will be is the physical activity inspiration, i.e. participation of their mother and the interest of their father. So going back to the point about the media, yes, it's about coverage and yes, it's about sponsorship and it's all those things that you mentioned, Convener, but it's also saying, well, actually, we need to be inspiring men and women to know how they can be parents that will inspire a young girl to be active. So I really don't want that point to be lost because I think the role of the media in that is really important. From a community sport point of view, I think, and again, part of this will be specific to women and girls and part of this will be systemic challenges that there are in sport at the moment. Community access to community facilities is one of the largest challenges facing not only sport but the voluntary sector as a whole. So sports clubs, the 13,000 of them, represent a third of the voluntary sector. If you add in then the uniformed organisations, youth organisations and other organisations around culture, arts, etc., that's 2/3 of the voluntary sector. And they are saying the biggest issue they are facing is the recruitment of volunteers and its access to community facilities, both of which are particularly relevant for women. So that's a massive challenge. And within that, I would say the school estate is a particular challenge within that. So again, women are sometimes challenged around confidence in going into facilities they don't know, and not all women are as confident in sport and physical activity as we'd like them to be. There are safety challenges, as you've all heard, around accessing facilities, late night travel, being able to actively travel as they'd like to. And there's a particular barrier of time that is exacerbated for women even more than it is for men, particularly those from deprived communities and single mums who are the least active. What's the solution there? A local facility. A facility that you know, a facility that's hopefully welcoming and it's something that's in your local area. A school, perhaps, might seem like a particular solution. So we talk about access to the school estate a lot, but I think it's even more relevant in this context. The last research that was done was by Sport Scotland in 2014 and showed that actually the school estate is not well used. It's open, but it's not well used. And David, I know that was something you talked about in a previous session about saying actually this is a nub of an issue. It's an issue for sport, but I think it's even more exacerbated for women. And similarly around PE as well. So no role modelling has come up an awful lot, but actually we're looking at a decline in PE teachers from peripatetic and from permanent PE teachers, particularly in primary schools. We're looking at a situation where there actually are fewer PE teachers than there have been. And from primary schools, we're looking at a position where teachers are having to do ever more. Well, surely as well as your parents, your teachers are some of your first role models. Do we have enough PE teachers? Do we have enough female PE teachers who are actually providing that positive educational experience for young people who are then hopefully leaving school thinking sport and physical activity is a choice I want to make throughout life and I have the competence to choose the sport and physical activity I'd like to take part in? If we can nail those slightly differently, then I think we're in a different place for clubs being able to pick up a mantle, for coaches, for volunteers to be able to work that through. But the two limiting factors for many clubs that have waiting lists, of which female sports clubs are a huge part of that, access to facilities and coaches and volunteers to support that.
Okay.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, everybody. It was to pick up on what Kim was saying about the facilities and availability. When Gillian Martin was our previous convener, she talked about in Iceland that basically they would hand the keys over to the kids at the school because they trusted them just to get on with it and access the facilities. Now, we don't do that here, but is that something that you think we should be progressing, or do we have any data about the use of the school estate after 4 o'clock in the afternoon? And is that a model that we should be pursuing, looking at other countries? Because David mentioned Denmark and what they're doing, and I'm looking here at what they're doing with the Gina Davis Institute in America about encouraging young women into sport and athletics. So we can certainly take best practice from other countries, shouldn't we? Isn't that what we should be pursuing?
100%, Emma. I couldn't be more supportive of your point. That's exactly it. At the end of the day, I guess the irony as I see it, and apologies if we're oversimplifying it, the school estate is a community facility. So it's a facility that is run by the local authority with community money, on behalf of the community. And the community can't get in, Emma. If that doesn't strike me as a complete irony, then I'm really not sure what is. So exactly, there are models where these things work, and a lot of the research has shown that, and let's be very clear, this is the outdoor school estate, not just the indoor school estate, is that if things are open, outdoor playing fields and pitches are open, people don't break in. They respect them a little bit more, there's less vandalism, there's less break-ins, that kind of thing. But as I say, this is about the whole voluntary sector, and again, of which women are a huge part in that. Again, if you're talking about guides, Brownies, that network and the other uniformed organisations, there's a huge part of physical activity is taken part for women within that network. It's one of the biggest barriers. There are huge financial pressures, as we've all talked about, in local authorities. Accessing the school estate is difficult. There's planning issues, but more often than not now it's cost that is the challenge. And I've talked about this in the 13 years I've been in this post, Emma, and I'm still not 100% clear on what that is. So if there was an ask we could make of the committee, it would be for there to be an inquiry which is cross-committee. So this committee, the local government committee and the education committee to say, what's the problem? Because I don't think any of us know. And it's a conversation we have routinely across sport, is actually why can nobody get into the school estate? Why is it so expensive? What can that different model look like? Because again, I think it's particularly important for women and girls in that area and environment that they know. I thought Kate from Living Streets had some phenomenal examples about planning for women and why that is so important. And again, I think that plays into the part of the school estate. So it's availability, it's access, but it's also the cost of that. And it's incredibly challenging. The last research I understand was done in 2014, which showed that a lot of it's open, but it's very, very rarely used in comparison to the space that could or should be available. And I think we want to understand more about that. Right. Thank you. I think it's a great question, and I think I saw the great video you guys saw before one of your other sessions, and I think it's an interesting question as to what is a role model, because I'm kind of assuming they were to your student, which is amazing, because I think role models are everywhere, and I know we said in Women and Girls in Sport Week ourselves, I feel incredibly lucky to be in this position, because actually I see phenomenal female role models everywhere I go. The challenge is people don't get the profile that other people actually see them. And, I think, in the committee evidence session, you've seen some tremendous female role models and male role models who are incredibly supportive of women's sport. So they do exist. So I think that's the first part. I think the second part is working out where they exist and what that could look like. So leadership is a hugely important part, as Ailsa was saying, in supporting that. So our governing bodies, they've done a huge amount of work in bringing more women onto boards, because these are women who have skills, who have confidence, but who are bringing a different diversity of thought, who are bringing diversity of perspective, but who are also bringing a passion for women and accessibility and the benefits that can provide. I think there's also something I mentioned, PE teachers. I think that's a really strong role model, not just women's female PE teachers, but also male PE teachers in terms of showing that support for women. Coaches is one that we come back to often, and there are more male coaches than there are female coaches. There are more male volunteers in sport than there are women in sport. I would suggest one of the underpinning parts, again, is time. More people, one of the main reasons people say they don't volunteer is they don't have time. And the least people who are least active, again, are single mothers in deprived areas and women just generally. That's no accident, I imagine, in terms of that. So one of our big asks in that is how do you give people time? Well, where do you spend most of your time? At work, for the most part, for a lot of people. Well, so something we discussed with the committee, I think, in the last inquiry, is saying we're pushing forward an idea of a well-being employer. And what is a well-being employer? It might be somebody who gives 4 days a working week, as I know you've raised before, Gillian, I know we've discussed. But it's about an employer that gives time for their staff to be physically active. It's that gives them time to volunteer. Now, that would benefit everybody, but I'd like to think the people that might benefit most from that are women. So I know, again, Ailey gave some great evidence from Scottish Student Sport, where you look at the student network and say, well, actually, there are more women members of student clubs than there are men. And then they go into working environments where you work 9 to 5, or there isn't that same flexibility, or women now go into, you know, more caring roles and things where, again, actually we create systems that are quite difficult for people to be as active as they'd like. Well, maybe we'd have more female coaches and female volunteers as role models if women had time. So let's not make cost a barrier to giving that time. Let's make employers say, well, actually, this also helps their well-being. At a time of really difficult recruitment market, you might find it easier to recruit and retain staff. So I think there's a huge part in there. And there's also about men being incredibly positive role models. You know, they're half the population. They're an incredibly important part. And I know this has been raised with the committee as well. And I know one of the discussions was around Andy Murray. But there will be other incredibly strong male role models who are saying, actually, my mum was an incredibly positive indicator. Now, whether they happen to be as a crack at a coach as Judy Murray is a different question. But they are incredibly important role models within that. So I think we need to provide people with time, but I think we also need to talk about where we're profiling these role models. So we do a bit of work in Women and Girls in Sport Week each year where we try and profile amazing women doing amazing things in sport. So we'll share it with the committee if that's helpful, but we did some videos of women who've received honours through sport just recently. So incredible women who've changed access rights in Scotland. You know, one of the things across sport and physical activity we'd probably all be most proud of is we have world-leading access rights. Well, there were some really strong women drove that forward and are still continuing to drive that forward in many different spaces. But where are we all championing that? Within our communities, but also just within in general life. We need to talk up more, and that's a role I feel the media need to play a strong part in. So they exist, and we want more of them, but we also need to make it a place that's comfortable and people think, yeah, okay, if I'm a role model to one person in what I do, then that works. So how can we make it easier for people to find those role models that will inspire them?
I mean, what are organisations doing about targets and action plans and making sure we really get into diversity? Kim, you're nodding.
I am, because I think it's a tremendously important point, Evelyn, and I'm going to disagree slightly with Maureen, certainly not in that it's important, but in the work that governing bodies have been doing, and that's work that we do with them through our On Board for Sport programme, the only programme that exists in that space in the voluntary sector, and the support that Sport Scotland provides. So we do an annual survey of our members, and the average is 35 to 65 in terms of percentage male-female. Now, I know the aspiration is 50-50. The average size of a sports board is 9, so unless we're going to cut somebody in half, 50-50 is quite difficult, and usually sports governing bodies carry one vacancy at any time. So actually 35-65 is actually a pretty good split and represents where they are. Now, yes, it could be the other way, 35 to 65, but we're in a position a number of years ago where that was not the case. So governing bodies are taking this incredibly importantly and are very, very passionate about it. What Maureen said that I absolutely agree with is the point is confidence. So I don't agree with quotas and targets. Something I feel incredibly passionate about. My first board role was on the Sport Scotland board when I was 22. So women in governance is something I've been very passionate about for a very, very long time. But it takes confidence to actually put yourself forward, and it takes a little bit of time to actually build that up. So throwing women into these positions is not, I think, a helpful space. What we do through our On Board for Sport programme is try and identify women who have an enthusiasm to do that. And we talk with them and we interview's the wrong word. We have discussions with them about what they want to be, where we could match them with somebody. We're looking at setting up a buddying and a mentoring scheme. So there are opportunities for women to get involved. And exactly as Ailsa was saying, women are saying, oh gosh, I've got nothing to offer. And you chat with them, had a conversation with women exactly last week. Phenomenal women, very senior in a very, very a strong number of very high profile businesses. She's saying, but what would I have to offer? It's a very female question. I'm saying, are you kidding? All of our governing bodies would bite their hand off to have you. Well, gosh, I'm really not sure what I would have to offer. Well, would you like to have a conversation with somebody? I'm happy to be there with you. Here are some of the types of the questions that you might need to ask. So we need to work to provide women with that confidence, and that's work that we're doing across the sector. Quotas, not going to be helpful, and I feel would push things back. Developing confidence, developing skills. 2 sessions we're running next week, being Volunteers Week. We're running one with the Scottish Government and one with the financial sector to say, this is how people can volunteer, this is how you can get involved in boards, and there are many ways that you can do that. That, I think, is the key.
The point's been made about the need to increase visibility of disabled women in sports. How can that be achieved with regards to women with hidden disabilities, including people with mental health conditions? Could I maybe pick on Kim first?
Briefly before, and in terms of your point about social media and influencers, then I'm very rudely going to turn the tables, David, and say October is Women and Girls in Sport Week, first week in October. You'll all be getting an invitation from us, as every MSP will, to make a video of why sport and physical activity is important to you, and why that's important for women and girls. So I would invite each of the committee convener, if that's okay, to support that. You are all influencers. I'll bet you all have an awful lot of social media followers. I'm actually not joking. I think that's incredibly important. The most watched videos we had that we made as the SSA, we're a staff of 6, so there's not a lot of us, are the ones on the role models of a woman in being physically active to her daughter and the role models of a father for a daughter. So food for thought there, perhaps. In terms of disabilities, I'm delighted that you called in, and absolutely rightly so, Lynn Glenn from Scottish Disability Sport. Scottish Disability Sport do an amazing amount of work, an amazing award-winning work in a very small space. And by small space, I mean small budget, in trying to move that forward. So I know that the messaging that they continually put forward is around inclusion, and rightly so, but inclusion that we have to actually be quite specific about it. So when we say it's about everybody, that sometimes is then lost about disability being part of that. So I think there's a very specific focus that we need to take, and you're right about what people see or don't see as disability, and I think that's a challenge. But it is about their sports inclusion model. It is about being able to work to the guidance that they provide, which they provide across all governing bodies. They provide support across governing bodies to try and say, look, this is how things can be more inclusive. This is how games can be adapted. This is why PE is so important. So it took them longer than anyone would have hoped to embed their award-winning training programme into every education provider, to say that actually they need to take part in their disability inclusion training, their award-winning DIT training, to make sure that every PE teacher actually knows how to support somebody with a disability as they go in as a teacher and then as a PE teacher. And everybody that's been on that course says they're a better teacher as a result of it. Not a better PE teacher, but just a better teacher as going on that course. So it took a long time for them to get that rollout. Again, trying to get support from partners was difficult, but it's incredible what they do. But it's then looking and saying, well, actually, what does that mean then for health professionals now? So if we're working with education really successfully, what can that mean for health professionals to say, you're seeing somebody with a disability, whatever that may be, here are ways that you could be active, here are ways that you can get involved, and here are different community avenues and opportunities where you could find benefit from that. So I couldn't support more the incredible work that Scottish Disability Sport do, and more power to their elbow to say, well, actually, they're doing great work with their GOGA programme in Tayside. I think that was one of the evidence papers that came in as well, saying, well, we just need to provide more support to them to be able to roll that out. While we would all talk about sport and physical activity changing lives, Scottish Disability Sport will talk about sport and physical activity saving lives. That's the level of importance of that.
We also obviously encourage sporting figures to be more open about stress, anxiety and depression, and I think we've come a long way in that. And obviously people with those mental health conditions may not necessarily come under the Scottish Disability Sport side of things, but still will participate in both organised sport and other physical activity as well. How do we support people with specific diagnoses better? In particular, I'm thinking people with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, personality disorders, about which there's less understanding and awareness. How do we ensure they're welcome in sport and that they're understood by teammates, coaches and others to ensure that they can get the best support out of what they're doing?
I'd suggest 3 actions, if that's okay, on specific that point. The first is 2 hours, 2 periods of PE, fab, not for S5, S6. So arguably the most stressful point of any child's life, and again, key drop-off point for women. They don't have the mandated number of hours of PE, so that would be one action. The second one would be, there seems a bit of a paradox in terms of, we talk about equality or underpinning everything that we do, and we'll all say that because it's absolutely right and it's true, but we measure on numbers. So we say, how many coaches have you got? How many members have you got? How many people were at that session? Well, actually, some of the types of or people that have the challenges that you were talking about, Gillian, might take a little bit more time and more encouragement and a different kind of pathway. But if we're measuring on numbers, you can't underpin with inequalities. So sport structurally needs to change, and that's a conversation with government about changing what it is that we measure to make sure we are actually able to focus on equalities and not saying, but we also need to work on numbers. The third part would be exactly as you say, and mental health, I know being a passion of yours as well, convener, is saying sport and physical activity impacts across every national outcome that I can think of and every sustainable development goal I can think of. But if you look at the national outcome, it's sport and physical activity, it's health and sport, and if you look into the detail of it, it's health. So we, on behalf of our members, will be responding to the current consultation on that, saying what we want and what we would very much welcome the committee's support on is a new national outcome that is sport and physical activity, because of the contribution it makes. If we're talking well-being, it being at the heart of the National Performance Framework, as it says it is, well, is there another activity that supports physical well-being, mental well-being and social well-being more than sport and physical activity? So that will be our submission on behalf of members, and we would very much welcome the committee's support in that. And I think that provides somewhere where we're saying people being physically active and women and girls being physically active is everybody's responsibility, but actually something everybody is accountable for in a different way.
You just touched on the issue of the data picture in Scotland, and do you believe, or do the fellow panellists believe, that this is sufficient to measure female participation in sport? Is it a form of data that's collected centrally, collated and analysed? Is there any opportunity to further improve this? I mean, really, are we making informed decisions? How does this data look to you, and how could it be improved?
I think there's a question on data and there's a question on monitoring. So it's the old adage of you measure what you value and you value what you measure. And I think, Flora will be closest to the sort of Scottish Household Survey and Scottish Health Survey parts. But I think there's a part of, there's an evidence base of what is it we're trying to prove. So governing bodies and others that are in receipt of public funding are rightly accountable for public funding. I make no bones about that, and nobody will compare about that. But we monitor and measure everything to the millionth degree, to the point that actually there are times I worry we're focusing more on monitoring and measuring than we are on actual delivery, because we've got to tick very many sets of boxes that we've got all this data, we've got this other thing. I'm not saying we don't need data, but I think there's being clear on what is it that we're monitoring and why, and there's I think a significant rationalisation could be taken. And I think there's also a question of, if we're talking about valuing the benefits of sport and physical activity. We've had this conversation with our members saying, well, why don't we ask every person that's a member of a sports club and that's a member of a gym and everything else 4 questions. So do you feel physically better because you've been active? Do you feel, in a better mental health space because you've been active? Did you learn any new skills or develop any confidence? And did you make any friends? Because if that's what we're measuring, then let's have a conversation about that. And if everybody measured on those same things, then we might get into a different place. We still need to understand the demographics if people are participating, because that's where we identify gaps and understand what we need to do differently. But we also monitor things to death sometimes. If you look at the small amounts of money that some governing bodies and clubs get, and this again would be across the whole voluntary sector, the amount of monitoring and measurement that goes into that actually takes away from some of the delivery. So I think there's a fine balance to be done, but I do think there's a rationalisation of what is it we're valuing, and let's measure that and not have to measure the death out of everything.
So, Kim, in your submission, you spoke of a lack of both in-depth and longitudinal research in Scotland in the last 20 years. Now, we heard from David, and certainly just now we've heard that there is some work being done. Who do you think the responsibility to collect this data should fall upon? Is it the Scottish Government, or is it organisations like Sport Scotland and clubs that have people that are there? I think it's an area where we all play our part, and I think it's beyond just sport and physical activity in that sense. So again, let's be clear, and Ailsa can confirm, we're talking about a budget of 30 million. It's not a huge budget in terms of what we're trying to do, and I would argue is that a smaller budget that impacts on more people. But I think everybody's keen to play their part there. I think it's getting the information, being succinct about what it is that we need and what we're going to try and do with that and how we're holding it, that it can actually be meaningfully assessed and meaningfully reviewed. But also I think it's explaining to people why it's important. I think, I often joke when I'm asked, you're on a phone call for something, you're trying to open, an account for something, and do you want my blood group next? There's an awful lot of data that everybody requires. And I think there's a little bit, we maybe need to be open and transparent as a society about what data we're gathering and why, because it's exactly as Ailsa said, that's why we want it, because we want to make things better and we want to improve and we want to understand and we want to break down barriers. But I think there's a reluctance from a lot of people to give data, which makes things quite hard. There's the standard prefer not to say, and I think there's a lot of response that come from that. So I think there's a role we all have to play in that, in working and moving things forward. I think our governing bodies are working really hard on it, but there's a systems part behind that as well. So a lot of our governing bodies have no staff. So a significant part of governing bodies have no staff at all, and it's run by volunteers. That's not an excuse, but it does make things quite challenging. There's no IT infrastructure behind it that supports that. So there's a way of us all working collectively that makes that a little bit easier. But I think one of the key questions in there is local authorities. So it was the point that was made earlier in terms of their accountability for this 90% of investment. So we're talking about community sport. They're the big players here, guys.
They're sitting with 90% of the investment in sport. What are they being accountable for? What are we challenging councillors on? Trusts are in an incredibly difficult position, but doing a really, really good job. We need to be asking the councillors and the councillors different questions, and that's a key question I would be asking them. So I think it's about a breadth of opportunity. You know, I'm very passionate about sport and physical activity, and I genuinely believe there's something out there for everybody, but I think that also varies by life stage and time that people have. And we know that the key indicator of life expectancy is how physically active you are. So that's your point about mothers, Stephanie. You know, you want to be live a longer life to see your kids grow old and maybe your grandkids grow old, then you want to take part in physical activity. So I think it's about people having opportunities to be active in whatever way they would choose. It's the point that colleagues have made about them being informed in what activity is that they would like, and it's the barriers that have been spoken about by colleagues throughout. But it's making sure that those opportunities exist and that they exist locally, and that's the challenge. As David came back to again about facilities. If people can't get into facilities and there aren't enough people to volunteer as coaches or as volunteers, then they're the barriers to anybody being active, and it's more prevalent for women. So breadth of opportunities, i.e. there need to be a number of different types of activity, but there also needs to be somewhere for them to go and people to make that happen, and they are massive barriers that we're facing across sport.